Welcome, everyone. We're really excited, Denise and I, to be here and want to thank BlueMet for inviting us to have a chat and introduce ourselves and this project, 80,000 Steps, a new show out with the CBC. So I'm Crystal, and I am the writer and creator of the show, which is a really experimental audio program where you get to actually walk while you listen to the story. And it was inspired by a very personal story, which I'll tell you a bit more about. And joining me here is Denise Chong.
Hello, Crystal.
Hello.
Yes, you asked me to join this innovative podcast, and at that time I couldn't imagine what it was. And you asked me if I would narrate the part of a grandmother, and I thought, oh, I'm an author. I'm used to pressing words flat to the page, and you are asking me now to make a story come alive through voice and character, through sound. So, of course, I was intrigued. I was in the middle of writing what is now my fifth book, just published. Uh, I'll do a plug later if I can. And so I was absolutely intrigued because normally I think of audio recordings as employing an actor. So my first thought was, why would Crystal Chan be asking me?
Mm-hmm. Well, the story and the role that you play, Denise, when you say grandmother, we're talking about my very own grandmother, who was the inspiration for this character, this pretty much the protagonist of the show. She is this sassy, fearless, not at all sitting at home and knitting type of grandma. And I was very much raised on stories, on her stories. Before I was a bookworm, it was about listening. It was about storytelling in that maybe traditional, organic way of pulling a chair up, oral storytelling, and that's typically a way I think that stories can be passed a lot through families. And we had this conundrum when I started working on this show where I wanted, my grandma spoke maybe 5 words in English, so I wanted very much, I had sat down with her, I had the gift of these recordings, audio recordings with her. I had the stories she had told me for decades while I was growing up that I was returning to. And I wanted to include these recordings. And that self, the CBC was very receptive, but it was also, this is an English language audience. And we're not just going to sit and play Cantonese Chinese. And most people listening in wouldn't understand that. So I knew we wanted to include those, but also had to have my grandma understandable. So dubbing into English, we're all familiar with that on the radio and movies and TVs. And I wanted to be able to do that in a creative way as well, to be able to let the listener, and if do check out the show and you'll see what I mean, where you do get to hear my real grandma, but then you have these two wonderful people, Vivian Wong, based out of Vancouver, who is a voice actor, and also then Denise, you, who
Mhm.
inhabited the role of my grandmother as the narrator. And it was interesting because I started out with just, well, I've got to have one person who can speak English and who
Mhm.
will, you know, translate my grandmother into English. And then it became clearer and clearer as the story went along what a what a kind of stepping into another persona and role it was to be a storyteller. And for my grandmother, it became really powerful to separate out um, her narrating this long, mythical, fantastical journey, with dragons and imaginary creatures, and that it was really special to have that be one unified single narrator. And um, Denise, I invite you to not be too shy about it. You're certainly not an actor, professional actor, but you are of course a storyteller. and you know how to weave a story. And of course, let's not forget my grandmother herself was no professional theater actor. And it was special to have someone, especially someone else, Chinese Canadian, who could tell that story.
Yes, I agree that on the idea of a storyteller, we shared something in common. We understood the drive of a story, the necessity of different voices. We so that was instinctive. Um, but there was something else that was more also a bond in that, of course, we both come from waves of immigration that came
Mhm.
from China and went to a distant shore and were poured out of China for various reasons of upheaval and political turmoil. So we shared that in common. I had a grandmother who also spoke only about 5 words of Chinese of English, and they were all, anglicized English, like toast would be toasty and porridge would be mushy. And, so really that English was really not even
Food words, the
English,
important ones to learn
the
in any
important one.
language.
Yes. So, yes, and then it kind of was the flip side for me by narrating this because you had a grandmother that told you stories and you didn't, until a lot later discover what layer was underneath those stories and why they were being told. I had the reverse.
Mhm.
My grandmother said little. My mother said even less. So I had this burning curiosity, and I was one who asked and asked and asked questions. And finally, not getting the answers led me to putting it down into paper and writing a book to unearth the stories, whereas you had the stories told to you, which you were then going to unravel.
Yeah, but that mystery solving and that persistent nagging, if you look at it one way, and persistent curiosity, if you look at it maybe in another, is very much in common. I could have just had Denise Chong, you narrate this mythical tale that my grandmother told, and that was the CBC show. But when you listen, you will hear that it's really a almost unbraiding of that story where the
Mhm.
protagonist of me, my character, my persona, is this very somewhat foolish, bumbling journalist detective who tries to unpack the story behind the story, what was really going on, veiled behind it. And I think that's a really interesting aspect of storytellers, whether they were my grandmother or us as writers, authors. We our trade is basically in some sort of imagination and fantasy, and imagination is straddling somewhat of a line between dream and, well, delusion, right? It's like what I learned from my grandmother in this story was that this idea of dreaming and imagination, which I so relate to as a writer, was not so much an escape from reality only, but a way of understanding and processing a reality that maybe for her as a child refugee was not understandable directly. It was a sort of sideways through story coping mechanism, you know, this child refugee who walks right into her dream world as a protective space. So yeah, I think that we can relate to that. I relate to that as an immigrant. We relate to that and think about that and how it affected our family. Um, yeah, this illusion and this dream, and Bloom Met, the theme this year is this theme of dreams and utopias, right? Um, of for Chinese Canadians might be this idea of Gold Mountain. Yeah, this sort of illusion as well as shining utopia.
Well, there's also in terms of dreams, and fantasy, there's the uh, trying to relay stories and experiences between generations. So you have your
Mm-hmm.
grandmother and then you have the child. And in your story, your grandmother is using storytelling to protect a child in times of turmoil. It's there still is the layer of truth there, but the child then has to later figure out what that truth is. And when you think of it today in the upheaval in the world, you can imagine parents in Ukraine, parents in Gaza, also making up stories to say, oh, this is what these noises are, this is what these people are. And so they serve a function in real life to help you navigate real life too. They may be dreams or utopia, but they served a very real purpose in your grandmother's life. It turns out to be protecting some of the family and then protecting you until you were old enough to find out what the story really was.
It is such a powerful tool for the person telling the story, for the storytellers, for us as storytellers, and I think also for the audience, for the readers, right? Like, why do we, like me, we both have looked to the past, to the history for sources of our writing, of our work, and why do it, right? Is there anything relevant and timely, and you point to Ukraine and Gaza, for this 80,000 Steps CBC show, I do think about what is the relevance of a story of, in my grandmother's case, this is nearly 100 years ago, what was happening in that past timeline, something on the other side of the world from us. Can that matter? How does it matter, for the audience, for the person listening, for the person reading? And I think for them as well, maybe less so a protective, um, tool, but it almost the opposite. I hope, I find it can be a way, stories like this, to prompt us to ask sometimes
Mhm.
uncomfortable questions. You relate to a story if it's working. So to a character, maybe my grandmother, if it speaks to you. And then you think about, what about uh, a real girl today? What are your own double standards? How can I relate to this character who's so maybe unlike me, or maybe very similar to something I've experienced? But it just gets you to question. And I grappled a lot with this project, Denise, with this idea of empathy. It's really built into the invitation to actually walk alongside the character, really kind of
Mhm.
inhabit their experience. And in the show itself, I do also try to unpack that a bit too, like ask you to empathize as audience, and then also kind of call into question, is it possible for you to truly empathize? Was it possible for me as the granddaughter to even fully understand what happened to my grandmother? It's very
Mhm.
important for me
Mhm.
to try, but it's also impossible for me. And I think a
Mhm.
parallel journey happens for the reader or the listener.
Well, when you ask, is it relevant to go back over history that, as you say, was 100 years ago? It's never not relevant. What is history but meant to be reinvented, retold, reimagined constantly? There is no one version of history.
Mhm.
But what I found of when you reach back and you relive or you reimagine or you recreate in such um, epic stories, in a sense, like your grandmother's, my grandmother, that went through such turmoil and upheaval and war and migration and loss and death. And when you explore those geopolitical forces, which I've done through each one of my books, and you
Mhm.
explore those tides of history, what you are also really doing, which is where the empathy comes, is you it how the person makes choices in their life
Mhm.
then reveals their human temperament. And that's when you just bond with, in your case, the listener. In my case, I would bond with the reader. Because that's what you're really getting at, that, the human condition. And that's what walking back through history and walking through it again up to today will help the reader
Mhm.
and listen.
Yeah, I mean, that's why it's important, or has been important for you, for us as the writers. But how might you do it, and with a sort of, respect or care? Do you struggle yourself, when you write about geopolitical events, as you say, about conflict and trauma? How do you yourself approach that?
Well, again, I you're not there to give a history lesson.
Hmm.
Because often when you're situating your characters within that history, they themselves may not know what forces are affecting them. They themselves, there's an old saying: the closer you are to war, the less you know what is happening.
Hmm.
So I see it that you're putting these jigsaw puzzle pieces in around the the characters, or the real people, and you're seeing how it pushes and pulls their lives and affects their lives. So even sometimes what they don't know has a stronger force on their lives, and even what they don't know, they themselves instinctively are still fighting against. Their temperament is still coming through. So it's not giving a history lesson as such. It's giving that context to a life and to a time. And if, for example, it's a time that affected generations of your family, or is a time that is in your living memory, it helps you understand what your place was in that
Hmm.
continuum or in present day.
Yeah, and I think that's the key to something I've heard since starting to share the show widely. A lot of different response of people either saying they've never heard about a certain political, geopolitical history or event, like, oh, I never knew this happened, no idea.
Mm,
Or even more interestingly, in a way, oh, I did read about it in two lines in a history book 40 years ago, I think. But this, hearing it through a story made me kind of actually understand it, or begin to be curious about it in a totally different way. So it's that was very curious, and even more so the leaps, the mental, emotional leaps that people then also take. Some people would tell me, you know, I don't know. I don't have any personal relationship with my grandmother. I didn't even know them. But your relationship, your curiosity, the story, it made me realize I hadn't talked to this old friend of mine. Why were we estranged? I picked up the phone, called them, went for a walk or something. So just this ability to kind of transpose what
yes,
you are hearing and
right,
make it
right.
relevant to you, and then the other way around, sort of being able to then bounce, almost echo back your
Mhm,
own, I guess, understanding helps be able to digest some of these historical events. Mm,
mhm. Well, I recall in my very first book, The Concubine's Children,
yeah.
I had received a letter from a fan, and said that, oh, I was right there in Chinatown. I lived through that time. I was in those rooming houses, and I recall, the old gentleman and living in those rooming houses, and wondered why they were all alone. And I remember it so vividly. Then I got to the last line of the letter, and it said, except I've never even been to British Columbia. I've never been in Chinatown in Vancouver. And in fact, I'm Irish and live in Southern Ontario. So you're right. When the person puts themselves in the shoes of, it's walking in someone else's shoes, is what it
Mhm.
does in the pages of a book. But you're actually doing it literally in 80,000 steps. You're actually making them literally walk in those shoes. And that's where I go back to where you say, where is empathy possible? I think it was
Yeah,
ingenious.
that old saying, right? Like, to understand someone, you've got to walk a mile in their shoes, whatever variation.
Yes.
That really is the foundation for the spark of my grandmother's lesson message, and what got me to experiment with this um, mode of storytelling, where
Hmm.
it's participatory, it uses technology and so on. But for a reason, I am actually quite, I will admit, quite a, I am, I think, younger than you, Denise, but still, I am quite a Luddite, I think, for someone of my generation or underneath in my daily life. I often, and maybe I shouldn't say this, but as somebody sharing a CBC show listened to through your phone on an app, but I often go out on these daily walks of mine, and I don't take my phone or anything, at all, in terms of a device. but it does interest me to create stories for, for the ear or for your phone or whatever it is in this case, because if it ties the story. So for me, this form and the message was really beautifully linked. It's something that I felt like my grandmother almost imagined
Hmm.
as a way of telling a story if today, if she was here
Hmm.
today making this story. And so that's what I hope is meaningful. And I think that it's very interesting because it's not only looking back, these intergenerational stories. You told me, you asked me something. We had coffee over Christmas, Denise, and you
Hmm.
surprised me by something that you maybe were surprised to hear your daughter ask you for.
Oh, yes. Well, we had a coffee, you're right. And I said, I knew it was it's podcast and you have the copyright on it. And I said, Crystal, do you think you could just give me a tape of my part in it? Because I've got my first grandchild, and my daughter has asked if she could have it to play and for her to kind of have it for the generations to come. Well, Crystal, my
Mm-hmm.
daughter Jade has come back to me and said now she wants the entire podcast for perpetuity, not just her mother's voice. She wants the entire thing, and she wants it, to have a place of honor in the library. And I think that's a testament to your podcast, and a testament to both our creative processes
Yes,
and why
absolutely.
we do it.
But I just love this imagining of your, grandchild. I also I still have trouble sleeping today, as the people around me know. And I very much have memories of being a child and being put into the room with the tape playing the of the bedtime stories, and it's just so
Mhm.
funny, wonderful an image of me to imagine your first grandkid, listening to your own voice through this show. But it's one concrete example of how when we're looking backwards sometimes into sort of past generations and intergenerational story, it can really lead to future generations and bridge to that. I mean,
Mhm.
your work time and again has talked about families, personal histories, like the lens of that, right? Looking at history, whether it's your own or lives of others in around the world, in Ottawa, beyond. I mean, what attracts you to these sort of family, personal history foundations, the stories that you write?
Well, it's always the wider issue that you're taking an intimate story in order to tackle what you think the wider issues are. And within the bigger sweep of history, even though it's just a very intimate story. So, yes, I have looked at family, and it happens in each one of my books, including my latest. Can I do my commercial plug now?
Please do. I'm so excited to see
Out,
it.
Out of Darkness. It's just published. Um, and interestingly, family
Mhm.
indeed has been the scaffolding of all my books. And why
Mhm.
is that? It's because it does. With family, you can cross generations, you can cross boundaries, including frontiers of countries, you can cross an
Mhm.
ocean, you can cross time. The family is always pushing against the outside society. So the scaffolding of family is quite it supplies the structure of a story, it supplies the drive of a story. So I often start there. And sure enough, it's kind of an anchor for each one of my books.
Mhm. It's true. It's this unit that's both so intimate and cohesive, but also spanning, as you say, time, distance, everything else,
Mhm.
ideas. And we all, no matter how different our family history is, and this is where we, I guess, learn, I'm thinking about right now, how to tell a story. And that might be like me with my grandmother, you're with somebody who's a true storyteller, gift of the gab. But I think we probably learn a lot also from when in families there's sort of this idea of curating stories, the story untold as well, or the things that, you
Mhm.
know, you learn how to kind of edit and frame and all these other things that we think about as writers, maybe first from seeing it done around us by family members.
Well, you're also, when you're telling stories, your each story, depending on the storyteller, can be told in a different way as well,
Mm,
because you're delving into memory and into crevices of memory that may have not yet been exposed, or, it has been told many times, and sometimes once memories get cannibalized, sometimes the story is lost. But the well is actually, I think, bottomless when it comes to stories within a family.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that you know, it really feels that way, especially with the power of imagination that my grandmother had with her
Mhm.
stories. It was the things that happened, then the things that happened, slant, and things that happened that never would have happened. And so it's all these different approaches. And I know for me, it probably was, lesson 101 in craft all the way back without it seeming, that way. And I wanted to have the listener, the audience of this show, be able to experience some of that, like kind of give you, the listener, a bit of the power to and frustration of the experience that I had. And following me as a stand-in, but you really get to, listen to it. And yeah, just I had this idea come to me through my past experience with my grandmother, and then many years later, having forgotten about it completely,
Mm.
discounted it. And I was out on a walk, very direct connection there. And it still annoys me, and it was so inspirational. And then having done the show, then I actually,
Mhm.
for example, I do interview some walking scientists who talk about, why that really unpack why that really is. But it is so true, like taking a bath or whatever. It annoys me so much how it still works to practice what I preach. And when I go out for a walk, I kind of come back and find thorny problems entangled, or that they're thornier, but just things have happened in the meantime. And yeah, and I think this idea of seeing things as you go through them, move through them, and kind of again and again in a new light. Like I led another storytelling walk, like the one I'm leading in Montreal for Blue Met. And it was fascinating because it was in Toronto, and I've never lived in Toronto. I don't know Toronto as a resident, I'll never know it that way, like somebody else. And I had one of the participants say, I took them through this walk, and it was very much not about I am the expert in the history of Toronto or anything, this is a landmark from 1942. It was about the show, 80,000 steps. But they said to me, I actually live really around the corner from here. I live a couple blocks away, and there were things that you pointed out or that we noticed that I actually saw for the very first time. Is this idea of new eyes, right? And when you're kind of living something through a story and just sort of in a fresh perspective. And that's very much um, a message that this show has that my grandmother taught me through a lot of trial and error, and me not listening to that message. So yeah, do you walk, Denise? Do you have something like walking is for me that gets you
Oh,
under
absolutely.
your
I,
skin?
I, I can't imagine any creative person not, using the walk to sort out and, get out of of a muddle of ways to go in a story or ways to go in a plot, or, where to take the story next. I mean, it's true. The rhythm of walking and the forward motion it just helps you sort things. I mean, I think this is true just of human nature. And it may not be what you end up with. May This has happened to me. It may not be what you decide in the end, but it makes you feel like you've made progress. So you come back to your desk and think, oh, I've got this there, and then you're not happy with it, but you've made progress, and you've started to sort through your your um your deliberations. But I also think walking, it's so let's imagine that I've got your podcast on at 80,000 steps, or and you talk about the person in Toronto noticing new things. Well, all right, I could be doing that, or I could be walking myself and thinking about what I'm grappling with in the book I'm writing.
Mhm.
As you're walking and looking around, your senses are more awake. You're looking, you're hearing, you're listening, you're feeling the air, you're seeing other people, and those senses stir around and start that's what kind of stirs the pot and awakens your creative instincts. So, like I say, it may not be what you end up with, but at least awakens them. So
Mhm.
yes, I think you picked up a very natural rhythm of creating a work in the walk. And again, I'll use the word that I thought that was ingenious of you.
Well, thank you, Denise. I think it's such a interesting friction and contrast. So this is how I found it. The show being something that I very much invite people to. It's a listening experience. You listen and listen and listen to these stories, and the outcome of which for many people, amazingly, has been to the opposite. To to share, to reach out to somebody, to tell their own story, and the same thing
Mhm,
for this walking and being open to senses. Well, it's through this the irony of through the experience of listening. I really wanted to create as well this feeling of walking in between me and my grandmother. We have this amazing sound design where you're immersed quite literally in the story, and you'll hear it almost like my grandmother and me walking. You're eavesdropping in the middle. You'll hear all kinds of both fantastical and natural world sounds all around you in this spatial landscape. And yet the experience leads to, after listening to the show, very much an increased openness to hearing what's really around you in the real world. That's one of the
mhm,
other benefits of the show being a walking um, show that I kind of didn't intend as much, but then I realized afterwards was wonderful.
mhm,
Is
mhm,
yeah, sure, you could listen to the show while walking back and forth, and I certainly have done this myself and folding laundry or something in your own home. But I think walking prompts people to go out of the house. And like there was one line of idea, a lot of the technical, logical people were excited about this, and the creative producers as well at the CBC. This idea of you can make a show that was very much tied to a specific place or type of place. And so you listen, it's like a listening audio tour where, you hear about the building you're looking at and that kind of thing, right? I on purpose created the show the opposite feeling where it
mhm,
forces you to be in your own world wherever that is. I force you to be in maybe usually quite mundane activities like walking to the grocery store, walking your dog, all of this. Because I wanted you to have this overlaying of stories of war, of utopia, of a Chinese Canadian experience, and that might not be your own, but really try you know overlapping your own lived experience to provoke
mhm,
that comparison, and sometimes that friction,
mhm,
sometimes that relatability. So that was really important to me, and that walking also enabled me to offer the listener in a way that um, it wouldn't have in another medium.
mhm. Well,
Mhm.
I often go back to the Ursula Guin who said, I tell you my story and you make it yours. So,
Mm.
that's the gift. You give the story, and because it belongs to it was mine and now it's yours, and you make it yours. So in effect, that's what we storytellers do, I think. That's why we, take the courage to share it and put it out in the world.
Yeah, what a gift, right? My
Mm.
grandmother's gift to me, take the story, now it's yours, for us
Yes.
to offer our listeners, and very, very directly, like take this into your own
Hmm.
life, step out the door.
Hmm.
It's yours now. So I'm really looking forward to having you watching this, listen, check out the show. Denise and I would love to hear what you think. And if you are in Montreal, please come by and take a walk together with a group. Maybe a bit like the person in Toronto, you might see Montreal in a completely different light. And yes, I'd like to invite Denise. Thank you so much for coming and chatting with me. And until next
It's a
time.
privilege, Crystal. It's a privilege.